The year of Jubilee. How do you forgive? How do you look out for one another and find the way just to bite the bullet sometimes and let things be? Or would you be more like the woman who was bitten by a rabid dog? And it looked like she's going to die from rabies, and the doctor told her that she better put her final affairs in order. And so the woman took pen and paper, thought about it, thought about it, and started writing furiously. In fact, she wrote and wrote and wrote. Finally, the doctor said, "Boy, that sure is a long will you're making there." And she snorted and said, "Will nothing. I'm making a list of all the people I'm going to go out and bite." Well, we hope there can be a little more friendliness in how we treat one another and how we look out for one another. That's certainly what Jesus meant when he talked about the year of God's favor. It reflects all the way back to the Old Testament about that season of forgiving one another for financial matters, property matters, social matters, whatever it might be. Forgive, to forgive very freely. When Jesus showed up at his hometown synagogue and preached that first sermon and defined his ministry, he was quoting from Isaiah 61. And I'd like to read that passage with you this morning, just the first few verses of the chapter, and see the ministry of Jesus in these words. "The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called mighty oaks, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor." And may God add power to the reading of these words, that they're not just simply words written millennia ago, but they're words that have life for us today, this very morning. Serving with Jesus' heart. He outlined what he intended to do to reach out to those who are in need, to reach out to the poor, the inhibited, the trodden down, the oppressed. And then the last point, to preach the year of the Lord's favor, to preach about forgiveness. It was called the year of Jubilee, and Israel was instructed way back in the book of Leviticus, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. On that 50th year, the Israelites were supposed to forgive everything. If you had debt, you write it off. If you had offenses, you wrote that off. If you had land that you had lost, you get it back. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? If you've got debt, you bet that sounds pretty good. If you're part of that 1% privilege that we have in our own American culture, what a nightmare that is. We got to forgive all these things. They'd have to compromise their power. Do you remember when Pat Robertson ran for president a few years ago? That was one of the big planks he had. He will resolve the national debt by declaring the year of Jubilee, and everything will be forgiven. I was a student at that time, had a lot of student loans, and I thought, that sounds like a great idea. Let's forgive all that stuff. I didn't have people owing me money. I owed money myself. So that sounded like a great idea. But there's a lot of problems in that, as you can imagine. It's a scary idea. At the same time, if you follow that through, if everybody just forgave everything, if, that's a really big if, that warrants discussion. Maybe some things could be resolved. Well, in the whole history of Israel, you know they never did it. Not once did they ever get to that point where they forgave everything. I think people love their power too much. They love their control too much. Couldn't extend out quite that much to forgive everything. But yet that same theme is still present in Jesus' preaching. That's what we want to focus on. How we forgive, how we reach out, how we care for one another, and not to oppress them, but to care and forgiving. Oscar Wilde, I liked his wit about things. He phrased it this way: always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much as you forgiving them. Knowing how to forgive. There was a man who had committed a fearful crime that had been sentenced in the penitentiary life. And he appeared before his parole board. And they asked him the simple question if he should be let free, and asked if he was going to be a good citizen, and asked mainly, if we grant you parole to allow you to go back into society, tell us, what would you do? What is your plan? Now they're expecting the answer to be, I would become a good citizen, get a job, become a good taxpayer, take care of these things. But this particular prisoner was just a little too honest, perhaps. The first thing I would do would be to kill the prosecuting attorney, kill the jury that found me guilty. Then I would hunt for the judge that sentenced me and shoot him. He was not granted parole, by the way, thank goodness. How we forgive one another, how difficult that can be. There's a concept in conflict resolution that's called the Hanlon's razor. And I've resorted to that so many times in my own life and for others as well. It's simply stated this way: never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. When you're cut off on the highway, don't suppose that person that cut you off planned it this early this morning to get you like that, but just attribute it to where it probably lies: stupidity. Just wasn't thinking it through. And a lot of offenses that are committed against us is simply that one rule. People were being stupid. They weren't thinking it through. They were careless. And it was an accident. Nothing personal. They just had a grudge. They were venting on anybody that passed by. But we're called to a new age. We're called to a different time. In the book of Isaiah, there's three basic stages in the book. And that first stage, the first 39 chapters, is a message of judgment. Chapter after chapter, judgment after judgment. God pronounces judgments on all the nations, all the people, and all of the crimes that are committed. But in chapter 40, something significant changes in the middle of the book of this grand theology. When the words come out, comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. And the whole tone of the book begins to change. It's no longer that of judgment and harshness, but now it's of comfort. And the final stage is a whole message of hope. There's a future for the people. There is an open-ended time. There's prospects for good vision and good living ahead. God changes his whole demeanor, his whole direction with humanity and the world itself. Now there's a message of hope, of forgiveness. Mark Twain, looking at that theme in the Bible, expressed it this way: the two testaments, the Old Testament and New Testament, are interesting, each in its own way. The Old Testament gives us a picture of these people's deity, of God, as he was before he got religion. And the other one in the New Testament gives us a picture of him as he appeared afterward, after he did get religion. God seems so much calmer in the New Testament. That theme of judgment is not there. There's now a theme of grace, a theme of hope, a theme of meaning and personableness. The walk to Emmaus is a spiritual retreat that people are called to take. I've been on that retreat. Anyone here been on Emmaus weekend? It's a great event to do that. And I was able to work my way up to be one of the speakers and directors helping put the weekends together. And one of the sayings that they have is make a friend, be a friend, and bring a friend to Christ. Make a friend. Step out of yourself once in a while. Step out of your comfort zone. Step out of your laziness, if you will. And the second one, build that relationship by being a friend. Being a friend, a supporting companion to someone. And in God's time, bring your friend to Christ. Invite them to church. Invite them to God, finding their own peace and direction. There was a little girl that was always scared to go to sleep alone in the dark. Oftentimes she'd want to sleep with her parents, but they were trying to help her conquer her fear. And meaning well, they would say, don't be frightened. Elizabeth, Jesus is with you. He will protect you. You don't need to be afraid. You'll be okay in your own room. And Elizabeth simply replied, yes, but Daddy and Mommy, I wanted Jesus with skin on. I want a real person there. How we find that relationship with our Lord in a real way, in a meaningful way. that brings us healing. Forgiveness helps us to release our own burdens, to release our own grudges, to release our own bitterness, and to allow that healing presence to come into us. It's what Jesus preaches. Forgiveness. Forgiveness for all. Tom Anderson has a different story. It's one of those stories that has a terrible, terrible start to it. During college, in his early years, before his career even started, they were doing things that college guys always do, just playing pranks and hazing and things like that. And one of these pranks went terribly wrong. And one of Tom's friends ended up dead from the prank that he was doing. It dogged him for his whole life. He could never let it go. Tom Anderson tried. He got married and he got a job and got some things squared away, but nothing ever really came together. The way Tom would describe it, when someone come up and shake his hand, it's like he had to stop and in mid-handshake to be able to say, I'm not worthy. If you knew what I had done to cause the death of a friend, you wouldn't do this. It got to the point where Tom would not trust any smiles. The bitterness was in his life. It had took its toll on his marriage. His wife finally had enough and she left him. His workers at job got tired of him and couldn't tolerate it anymore. He got fired from one job, floundered again, went to another job, it fell apart. Nothing, nothing was working for Tom. His life was destroyed by this awful accident that happened to him when he was just back in college. And his friends would pay attention to him, trying to care for him, but at a distance. No one could get close to Tom Anderson. And finally, they noticed something happened to him. Friends watching from a distance noticed that his life just turned around. He was able to get a job and keep it. He was able to work well. People appreciated him. They noticed his wife started coming back and they were spending some time together. They noticed that his wife moved back in with him. They had reconciled. They noticed that Tom started smiling now. And they were overwhelmed by this, but wondering. One of his friends took him aside and said, Tom, it's great to see you. Look like you're happy for a while. What happened to you? What was the miracle? And Tom Anderson shared his story. He said, you know what my life was like. Falling apart. I'd hit bottom several times. It couldn't get any worse. And one day there was a knock on the door. I opened up the door and a woman was there. And she introduced herself and said, you're Tom Anderson, I know. I want you to know that I'm the mother of the boy that died by one of your pranks back in college. And she came on in, was very forceful about all this. And she looked Tom squarely in the eyes and said, Tom, I've been watching you from a distance, and I want you to know some things. God has forgiven you for what you did. It was an accident. God's forgiven you. Your wife forgave you, even though you didn't believe it. Your co-workers forgave you, and you didn't believe them. And Tom, there's something I want you to know right now. I forgive you. I forgive you for what you did. It was terrible. The way I lost my son. But Tom, I forgive you. And Tom, you want to know something? There's one person that has not forgiven you, and that person is Tom Anderson. It's time you get with it, Tom. Get with the program. Start forgiving yourself for what everyone else has already done for you. Tom took it to heart. It nailed him. It got him. He realized he'd never forgiven himself. He'd made a mistake. It was an accident, never intended. But when he forgave himself, other things fell in line. He understood God forgiving him. He understood his wife forgiving him. He understood that mother of that boy forgiving him, and understood his own need that he forgive himself. To allow God's forgiveness to enter his life, to allow forgiveness to enter his heart, and to set it aside. Perhaps that's where you find yourself now. Understanding where forgiveness might be. It might be a distant mystery to you, but it's something we simply receive. To say, yes, Lord, I need your forgiveness in my life. I need to let it go. I need to find freedom for life, freedom for living.